Frankie, how do you plead to count 1, child abuse,
Guilty.
to count 3, child abuse?
With my deepest regret and sorrow for my family and my children. Guilty.
Time to talk about Ruby Franke, the woman who was willing to do everything to seem like the perfect mom, even exploit her own family. We're going to look at the book written by Shari Franke, The House of My Mother, and we're going to look at some interesting episodes. So, Shari Franke diagnosed her mother as Narcissistic Personality Disorder, and based on what she describes in her upbringing, it seemed like that could be the case. Let's look at some of the episodes. So Shari Franke mentions in the book that she has distanced herself from the mother, but she has received a letter from her mom after her mom went to prison. So let's look at that letter.
Ruby waxed poetic about the excitement of preparing for her firstborn, the care she took in choosing colors and decorations. She spoke of me as her baby, her words dripping with nostalgia for a time long past.
The letter doesn't mention anything of what has happened recently. It doesn't give any apology for the abuse that happened towards Shari's younger siblings. What Ruby Franke does mention is the childhood or the time when Shari Franke was a baby, when she was helpless, and probably when Ruby Franke was able to cover the needs of Shari Franke. But often with people with narcissistic personality disorder, it's difficult for them when others have emotional needs. They are more catering to their own emotional needs, and it becomes very difficult when a child grows up, become older, and start having needs of their own and demand more from the mother. Many narcissistic mothers might find themselves fully capable of covering the needs of a newborn baby and liking the feeling that this person is fully dependent on them and that they are able to cover the basic needs of the baby. It's not as threatening as when the child gets older and the child can potentially get more attention than you or start having emotional needs that you need to cover, and it's not all about your needs. Often people will experience that when they get older, their narcissistic mother would start comparing with them, trying to look as youthful or as pretty or trendy clothes and so on, and that can be challenging. They also find that communicating with the narcissistic parent, that whenever they express a need, that will be turned around and might be guilt-tripping the child for actually having genuine needs, which kids do have growing up. Shari mentions that the letter from her mother contains an apology, and not surprisingly, the apology doesn't mention any of the horrific things that had happened prior, the abuse of Shari's younger siblings.
The letter did contain an apology, not for any of the things I might have expected or hoped for. She didn't say sorry for the pain she'd caused us, nor did she acknowledge the reason she was in prison. Instead, Ruby expressed regret for not spending more time with me before I moved out before college.
Ruby Franke is focusing on that she should have spent more time with Shari Franke. Often you'll see that the narcissistic parent will not be able to take accountability or see the horrific things that they have done. They would rather pick something smaller to focus on instead and apologize for that. Something that's less threatening to their sense of self.
The Ruby who wrote this letter seemed to exist in a delusional reality.
Shari Franke's feelings are very understandable, often when communicating with a parent that has NPD or narcissistic personality disorder or even narcissistic traits. It's often give a sense that that person is living in a delusion and somehow you're not able to see the full extent of reality if you are consistently denying insight, like self-reflection and insight. Because in order to understand the reality as a whole, you also need to be willing to look inside yourself and also be willing to take accountability for the wrong things that you do.
Even now, behind bars, she still couldn't, or wouldn't, acknowledge the deeper wounds, the years of emotional manipulation, the public exploitation of our family life, the shocking harm inflicted on my youngest siblings.
Lack of accountability, even having gone through the justice system, proof has been displayed, juries have said their word, judges said their final judgment. She still is not willing to take accountability. And I think for anybody who's experiencing a narcissistic relationship, often they will try explaining, and they will keep thinking, if I just had the right words, if I just had more people telling them, if I just went through the court system or had a judge, then finally their eyes would be open and they realize, oh, I did a mistake, and say sorry, even if it's a minor or major thing that has happened. But the reality is that most likely they're not going to be able to do that self-reflection and be willing to take that accountability, unfortunately, even though that's what people yearn for in those relationships. Shari Franke goes on to explain what narcissistic personality disorder is, and she does a pretty good job.
Your mind is a fortress built to protect an incredibly fragile sense of self.
She explains how the person has this fragile sense of self or insecurity and is protecting that with an armor of grandiosity or trying to have a perfect exterior. And because of that, it's not willing to admit any mistakes or any wrongdoing, because that would destroy that kind of armor or be like an existential crisis for that person. It's obvious that Shari Franke has studied a lot into this, and it's understandable. You know, you want to understand where you're coming from. You want to understand what caused you this trauma that you're going through. And it's interesting, she does make a monologue what she is imagining that an NPD person has going on in their head continually.
It's a relentless, contradictory monologue. I'm special. I'm the best. But why doesn't everyone see it? They must be jealous or stupid. I need to show them how amazing I am. But what if they see through me? No, that's impossible. I'm perfect, aren't I? Of course I am. I have to be.
No, we can't say for certain if that's the monologue going on. As far as I'm concerned, I've not read that from a person actually diagnosed with that disorder, but it's interesting. It's not impossible.
The cruel irony is that this very shield, meant to safeguard the self, ultimately becomes a barrier to genuine connection and fulfillment. It's a fortress that keeps others out, but also traps the narcissist within.
Shari makes a good point. The armor of grandiosity, the armor of NPD, if you want to say in that sense, does hinder the person from experiencing true connection.
Her grandiosity was her armor. Any crack in this facade isn't just uncomfortable, it's existentially threatening.
They cannot share their vulnerability, and they can also not accept the vulnerability of others, and somehow end up in a lonely place where they have to seem perfect and where they are potentially continually hurting other people.
Realizing your own mother was incapable of truly seeing you, of loving you for who you are, rather than as an extension of herself, is a bitter pill to swallow.
This is really hard. You want to be affirmed by your mom, and in cases where kids are raised by narcissistic mothers, hopefully they get to a point where they realize that it essentially had nothing to do with them. Of course, you know, they might realize that intellectually, but still they're going to have that emotional wound.
It's the death of a fundamental childhood hope, the one where if you just try hard enough, mommy will love you unconditionally. But in a strange way, this understanding has also been incredibly liberating. I now know that I could never have been good enough or perfect enough to make Ruby truly happy or proud. The insatiable void I was trying to fill wasn't created by me, and it wasn't mine to fix. That realization, as painful as it is the first step on the path to healing.
The child will often be seen as an extension of the mother. Shari is correct in that. And because of that, the mother will not be able to validate the feelings of that extension and not have an understanding that that extension can have its own personality, its own rights, its own feelings, but instead see that as an extension that has to fulfill what I want it to fulfill, or it has to agree with me. It is part of me and therefore must agree with me and think the same as I do, feel the same as I do. And love will essentially only be extended or given when the extension of self is in agreement, and that becomes very confusing for a child and essentially is not considered unconditional love.
Maybe if she'd had the chance to pour herself into a high-powered career in banking or physics, fields where empathy isn't exactly a priority.
This is a very good point. Women with NPD or narcissistic traits will often do very well in a career because of the drive to be the best and to get admiration. And that drive could essentially be poured into something that is a little bit more healthy than having a family or having kids, where it might unfortunately get quite toxic. Okay, that was the end of this session. So, Shari Franke did a great job writing her books. I recommend it for anybody interested. And yeah, stay tuned for more videos.